The rations that German soldiers carried reflected this philosophy entirely. Hard bread that could crack teeth if you weren't careful, sausage that had been preserved to the point where it barely resembled meat, and tins of coffee substitute that tasted like burnt grain mixed with wood shavings. Going without a hot meal for days at a time wasn't just common, it was expected. Officers spoke of it with a strange kind of pride, as if empty stomachs somehow sharpened men for battle. The notion that their enemies across the field might be operating under an entirely different set of assumptions seemed impossible to process. Yet the reports kept filtering in from interrogations of captured Allied personnel, stories that seemed too bizarre to be true. Americans were supposedly bringing their cooking equipment right up to the advancing edge of combat zones, feeding troops while shells still screamed overhead and machine gun fire rattled in the distance. In the barracks behind the lines, where exhausted soldiers tried to catch whatever sleep they could between rotations at the front, these stories became fodder for jokes and derision. Men whispered to one another about the soft Americans who couldn't function without their rolling restaurants, painting mental pictures of enemy troops too weak to fight on empty stomachs. The propaganda machine had done its work well, creating an image of the Allied forces as fundamentally lacking in the toughness required for real warfare. Drawings circulated showing fat soldiers in American uniforms gorging themselves on steaks while their tanks sat idle, broken down from lack of proper maintenance because the crews were too busy eating. The implication was clear. All these fancy field kitchens would do nothing but slow the Americans down, make them vulnerable, expose their inherent weakness as fighting men. Reality, as it often does, told a completely different story from the one being sold in the propaganda sheets. The American Quartermaster Corps had spent years perfecting a system of mobile feeding that would have seemed like science fiction to most European armies. These weren't crude wagons with pots thrown on top. They were sophisticated pieces of equipment, steel trailers engineered with insulated kettles that could maintain heat for hours, burner systems that could operate in almost any weather condition, and storage racks designed to maximize space while keeping supplies organized and accessible. The whole apparatus could be hitched to a jeep or truck, transported across rough terrain, set up in less than 10 minutes, and begin serving hundreds of meals from a single cooking point. It was logistics elevated to an art form, the kind of industrial efficiency that only a nation with America's manufacturing capacity could have pulled off. As American units pushed deeper into the contested territory that autumn, grinding their way through forests turned into obstacle courses by mud and fallen timber, these mobile kitchens followed right behind them. The German soldiers who had dug themselves into defensive positions along the line began to notice something that didn't fit with anything they'd been told. The wind would shift, and suddenly there it was, the unmistakable smell of food being cooked. Real food. Beans simmering, coffee brewing, the rich aroma of actual meat being prepared. This happened while artillery shells were still falling in the middle distance, while small arms fire still crackled through the tree line. At first, the German troops convinced themselves it had to be some kind of trick, perhaps a bizarre attempt at psychological warfare. Some theorized that the Americans were trying to make them think they were more comfortable than they actually were, a morale play designed to demoralize the defenders. Others simply couldn't wrap their minds around the concept that anyone would risk valuable equipment and manpower to cook meals that close to active combat. But alongside the mockery and the attempts to explain away what they were smelling, something else began to creep into the consciousness of those German soldiers. Curiosity. The kind of gnawing interest that comes when what you're experiencing contradicts everything you've been taught to believe. They had been told the Americans were soft, undisciplined, more concerned with comfort than with winning. Yet these same supposedly soft soldiers kept advancing, kept taking ground, kept pushing forward through the same miserable conditions that the Germans were enduring. And somehow, impossibly, they were doing it while eating hot meals. The contradiction sat there like a pebble in a boot, small but impossible to ignore. Soon enough, these men would have the opportunity to discover firsthand the truth about the system they had spent so long ridiculing. The field kitchens that had seemed like a joke were about to become very real indeed. 2 nights after that initial propaganda leaflet had made its rounds through the German positions, the weather turned even worse. Rain came down in sheets, the kind of relentless downpour that turned every depression in the ground into a miniature pond and made visibility drop to almost nothing. The forest smelled like a mixture of wet earth, explosive residue, and the particular mustiness of uniforms that had been damp for so long they were starting to rot on men's backs. Across the contested ground between the two forces, American troops were engaged in activities that made no sense whatsoever to the German observers. Through the rain and gathering darkness, shadowy figures could be seen setting up what looked like canvas screens and portable barriers. Small trailers were being unloaded from jeeps and positioned with what seemed like excessive care given the conditions. The German watchers initially assumed this was standard military procedure, probably ammunition being brought forward or communications equipment being installed. Then the wind shifted direction, as it had a habit of doing in that particular stretch of forest, and carried with it a smell that stopped conversations mid-sentence. The rich, unmistakable aroma of fresh coffee being brewed, the scent of meat in boiling water. Inside their waterlogged dugout, German soldiers looked at one another with expressions that mixed confusion with something that might have been longing. One of them finally spoke what they were all thinking. The Americans were cooking. Here, in this place. While the rain hammered down and shells continued to fall sporadically in the hills beyond. A sergeant pulled out binoculars, wiping the lenses repeatedly to clear them of moisture, and confirmed what seemed impossible. Mobile kitchens had been rolled into position, set up just behind what could reasonably be called the front line. Men in uniform were actually working over steaming pots while the weather tried its best to make everything miserable. A young private, barely old enough to need to shave, whispered that it must be some kind of morale display, something to make the troops feel better before a big push. Another soldier, older and more cynical, made a dark joke about letting the Americans have their little party because German forces would just capture all that equipment once the inevitable retreat began. But the Americans showed no signs whatsoever of retreating. They formed actual lines, orderly queues of soldiers holding metal trays, their helmets tilted to keep the rain out of their faces. Steam rose from the food as it was served, visible even through the rain, and men ate standing there under hastily erected tarps that provided minimal shelter. From the German perspective, watching this scene unfold through binoculars and over iron sights, the whole thing looked absolutely surreal. These were soldiers who should have been hunkered down in whatever cover they could find, conserving energy, staying alert for enemy action. Instead, they were calmly going through the motions of a meal service that wouldn't have been out of place in a garrison town miles behind any fighting. The shock went deeper than just seeing the kitchens in operation. What truly unsettled the German observers was that the American forces didn't slow down their military activities one bit to accommodate this feeding operation. Patrols still went out into the rain-soaked darkness, moving with the same purpose they had shown before dinner was served. Artillery crews continued their work, sending shells arcing into the night. Radio operators stayed at their posts, maintaining the constant chatter of military communications. The Americans were somehow managing to fight a war and feed their troops hot meals at the same time, treating these two activities as if they were perfectly compatible rather than mutually exclusive. In the Wehrmacht, the standard expectation was that men would go a full day, sometimes 2 days, without anything hot to eat when operations were underway. It was considered a necessary sacrifice, the price of maintaining operational tempo and battlefield mobility. Watching the enemy treat hot meals as just another routine part of combat operations challenged every assumption about how war was supposed to work. That night in the dugout, as the rain continued its assault and darkness settled over the positions, whispers started circulating among the German troops. Half of what was being said came from a place of pure disbelief, an inability to accept what they had witnessed. The other half came from somewhere more uncomfortable to acknowledge: envy. Someone spoke quietly into the darkness about how good it would be to have soup. Just one bowl. Something hot to drive away the cold that had settled into their bones and refused to leave. It was a small thing to admit, wanting warm food, but in that moment it represented a crack in the carefully constructed wall of superiority that propaganda had built. If the enemy was truly as soft and undisciplined as they had been told, how were they managing to advance through this same miserable forest while eating meals that would have been considered luxurious by German standards? The question hung in the damp air of that bunker, and nobody had a good answer. What they didn't know was that the answer would be provided to them much sooner than any of them expected, and in a way none of them could have anticipated. The fighting that consumed that autumn was the kind that ground men down through sheer relentless pressure rather than spectacular clashes. German units found themselves stretched increasingly thin across defensive positions that seemed to grow longer every day while their numbers grew smaller. Ammunition stocks dwindled, rationed out in smaller and smaller portions. Food became even scarcer than usual, with supply lines disrupted and rear echelon units unable to push rations forward with any reliability. During one particularly chaotic engagement that took place in the darkness just before dawn, near a crossroads that probably had a name nobody remembered, an entire German squad found itself cut off from friendly positions. By the time the sun came up, revealing their hopeless tactical situation, they were completely surrounded. The order to surrender came from an officer who was being realistic about their chances of survival if they tried to fight their way out. Hands were raised, weapons were laid down, and the men stumbled forward through mud that tried to suck the boots off their feet. What they expected was rough treatment at best. Stories circulated about how different armies handled prisoners, and while the Americans had a reputation for being relatively humane, battlefield situations could be unpredictable. They anticipated shouted orders, physical searches conducted with unnecessary roughness, perhaps some shoving or worse from soldiers whose friends had just been killed. What they actually encountered was something closer to bureaucratic efficiency. An American sergeant with a clipboard went through the process of frisking each man for weapons, making notes about their unit designations and rank, tagging their uniforms with prisoner numbers. Then, with minimal ceremony, they were directed toward a collection of tents that had been set up in a clearing behind what was still very much the active front line. Initially, the prisoners assumed this was where interrogations would take place, where they would be questioned about German positions and strength and capabilities. Then the smell reached them, and everything they thought they knew about being a prisoner of war got turned completely upside down. Coffee, real coffee, not the terrible substitute they had been choking down for months. The sharp smell of onions being cooked. Something richer underneath it all. The kind of aroma that only came from actual meat being prepared properly. The prisoners looked at each other in confusion that bordered on panic because nothing in their experience or training had prepared them for this particular scenario. Sitting there under camouflage netting, positioned close enough to the fighting that you could still hear the occasional burst of small arms fire, was one of those mobile kitchens they had been mocking for months. Real cooking equipment, real food being prepared, steam rising from kettles that looked like they belonged in a restaurant rather than a combat zone. Soldiers wearing aprons over their uniforms worked with practiced efficiency, ladling portions of food into metal trays that were being distributed to anyone who approached. The prisoners were formed into a line that merged with American troops who had just rotated back from patrol duty. There was no separation, no special treatment either way. Everyone got a tray and moved through the serving line in order. A cook, looking tired but focused on his work, held up a ladle full of beef stew and gestured toward one of the German prisoners. The man hesitated, looking around for some sign of what he was supposed to do, whether this was a test or a trap. The cook just shrugged with the kind of casual indifference that suggested he had better things to worry about than the internal confusion of prisoners, and poured the stew onto the tray anyway. It was thick enough that it settled into the metal compartment rather than sloshing around. Chunks of actual potato were visible, along with pieces of carrot that still had their colour. The prisoner's hands shook as he accepted the tray, a tremor that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the fact that he hadn't eaten anything even remotely this substantial in longer than he could clearly remember. When he finally worked up the courage to actually taste the stew, his eyes went wide in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. This wasn't just food for the sake of putting something in an empty stomach. This was warmth spreading through his body, salt and fat and protein all combining to deliver exactly what a starved system needed. The building blocks of human strength served up in a metal tray in the middle of a war zone. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some of them stared down at their portions as if they had been handed bars of gold instead of beef stew and potatoes. A few muttered things under their breath in German, expressions of disbelief that their captors wouldn't understand even if they could hear them over the general noise of the feeding operation. Others gave up on trying to process what was happening and simply ate in silence, feeling the heat of the food bringing colour back to cheeks that had been pale with hunger and exhaustion. An American guard walked over carrying a large metal container of coffee and set it down near the prisoners with the kind of casual gesture that suggested this was completely routine. One of the Germans approached it like it might be dangerous, sniffing suspiciously before allowing himself to pour a small amount into the metal cup he'd been given. The first sip made him flinch, more from the strength of the brew than from the heat. Real coffee had a bitterness that the ersatz version could never quite match, but underneath that bitterness was a richness that made the whole experience worthwhile. The warmth spread through him in a way that felt almost medicinal, driving out cold that had taken up permanent residence in his core. In that single moment, an entire edifice of assumptions came crashing down. Years of jokes about soft American soldiers evaporated like steam from the cooking pots. These men, their captors, were managing to serve hot meals while operating under fire, in the mud, under conditions that were objectively terrible. And now they were extending that same level of care to prisoners who had been trying to kill them just hours earlier. For the German prisoners, this field kitchen represented a fundamental shift in understanding. It was no longer an abstract concept to be mocked in propaganda materials. It was real equipment operated by real people producing real food, and it worked in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about the relationship between military effectiveness and soldier comfort. The kitchen wasn't a sign of weakness or decadence. It was evidence of a system that had been built on entirely different principles than the ones that governed the Wehrmacht. Abundance and planning instead of endurance and deprivation. Organization instead of improvisation. The industrial capacity to treat food as just another form of ammunition, something to be delivered to the front lines with the same reliability as bullets and shells. That first meal as prisoners became a reference point, a moment that divided their understanding of the war into before and after. Before, when they believed their own propaganda about enemy weakness. After, when they began to understand that strength could manifest in forms they had never been trained to recognize. The turning point had been reached, though most of the prisoners wouldn't have been able to articulate it in those terms. They were still damp from the forest, still wearing uniforms that marked them as defeated enemies. They sat under a tent that existed solely for the purpose of feeding people, trying to make sense of how such a thing could be present on an active battlefield. The Americans had moved food forward as if it were ammunition, with the same logistical precision that kept guns supplied and vehicles fueled. A captured German sergeant, a man who had been responsible for ration distribution in his own unit, stared at the steam rising from the cooking kettles with an expression that mixed professional interest with something closer to despair. "How?" he muttered to nobody in particular. "How is this possible here, in this place, under these conditions?" An interpreter, one of the American soldiers who spoke enough German to facilitate basic communication, overheard the question and provided an explanation that was probably meant to be helpful but landed like a hammer blow. Every American infantry regiment, the interpreter explained, carried its own dedicated field kitchen platoon. Not shared between units or positioned far in the rear, but integral to each regiment's organization. Truck convoys delivered rations according to schedules that were planned and maintained with the same attention to detail that governed ammunition resupply. The mobile kitchens themselves were designed to heat food in insulated containers that kept it warm for extended periods, allowing meals to be served even when the cooking equipment had to be moved quickly to avoid enemy fire. This wasn't something they were making up on the fly or improvising in response to local conditions. It was a system that had been refined through years of development, tested and improved, standardized across the entire army since early in the war. The prisoners listened to this explanation with expressions of dawning comprehension. In their own army, cooks remained stationed far behind the fighting, in positions of relative safety. Meals arrived at the front cold if they arrived at all, carried forward by whoever could be spared to act as runner. The idea that an army would dedicate specific units and equipment to the sole purpose of feeding soldiers hot food at the front line represented a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. One prisoner leaned toward another and whispered something about the Russian winter, about a time when his unit had been reduced to melting snow in whatever containers they could find, just to make something resembling soup. The contrast with what he was experiencing now, eating real beef stew prepared by enemy soldiers who had set up cooking equipment within sight of active combat positions, was almost too large to process. Outside the feeding tent, more trucks were arriving with fresh supplies. Sacks of flour got stacked with military precision. Crates of canned goods were unloaded and sorted. Barrels of coffee beans, actual coffee beans rather than the roasted grain substitute that passed for coffee in German rations, were rolled into storage positions. The entire operation ran with the kind of smooth efficiency that you would normally associate with a factory or a well-managed warehouse, not a temporary facility set up in a combat zone. The Americans treated their kitchen equipment as vital infrastructure, the same way they treated artillery pieces or radio equipment. They rotated cooks forward under armed guard to ensure the feeding operation could continue. They made certain the mobile kitchens remained operational and protected, that supplies kept flowing forward according to schedule. The German prisoners began to grasp a truth that cut deeper than anything they had learned from propaganda or training. Hot food wasn't a luxury that soft armies indulged in because they lacked the stomach for real hardship. It was logistics made manifest. It was planning and organization, and a recognition that well-fed soldiers fought better than hungry ones. It was morale as a weapon, hunger as an enemy to be defeated just as surely as the opposing army. An older prisoner, a man who had seen combat in multiple campaigns and considered himself experienced in the realities of warfare, spoke quietly to the men around him. "They don't just fight with weapons," he said. "They fight with food." The others nodded slowly, mechanically lifting spoons to their mouths, tasting stew that represented more than simple nourishment. Even the small details impressed these men who had been raised in an environment of scarcity. The trays had compartments designed to keep different foods separate. Mugs were shaped to clip onto belts, allowing soldiers to carry their coffee while keeping their hands free. Food was stored in vacuum-sealed tins that preserved freshness far better than anything in German logistics. To soldiers whose entire military experience had been defined by making do with whatever was available, these weren't luxuries or signs of decadence. They were evidence of an industrial machine capable of applying manufacturing sophistication to the problem of feeding armies in the field. The kind of attention to detail that went into designing a better food tray might seem trivial, but it represented a level of systematic thinking about soldier welfare that simply didn't exist in their own military structure. And in that realization, that recognition of the gulf between systems rather than just the gap between individual capabilities, lay the first genuine crack in the myth of German military superiority. It became impossible to maintain the belief that their side possessed some inherent advantage in toughness or discipline, when the enemy could deliver hot meals to soldiers under fire, while German troops ate cold rations and convinced themselves it made them stronger. The prisoners were beginning to understand that their opponent's true power came not from any single piece of equipment or any particular tactical doctrine, but from an ability to nourish men while simultaneously fighting a war. From treating the feeding of soldiers not as an afterthought or a luxury, but as a fundamental component of military operations, equal in importance to ammunition supply or communications. By the time the second week of captivity arrived, the German prisoners had undergone a transformation that was visible in their posture and their routines. They no longer approached the field kitchens with the wide-eyed disbelief of those first days. The process had become familiar, almost comfortable. They lined up calmly when mealtimes approached, trays held ready, moving through the serving line with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this enough times for it to become automatic. Morning coffee transformed into a ritual that marked the beginning of each day. Steam would rise from metal mugs while frost still clung to the ground in stubborn patches that refused to melt until the sun had been up for hours. For men whose entire coffee-drinking experience had been dominated by the terrible ersatz substitute that the German military provided, the real thing carried an almost intoxicating quality. The bitterness, the richness, the way it seemed to clear fog from your mind as it warmed your body from the inside out. The Americans maintained a strict schedule for meals that felt profoundly strange to soldiers who had been trained to eat whenever food happened to be available and whatever could be scrounged or distributed. Breakfast at a set time each morning. Lunch when the sun reached a particular position in the sky. Dinner as evening approached, regular as clockwork. It imposed a structure on each day that was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that even in captivity, even in the middle of a war, some things could remain consistent and predictable. The prisoners found themselves assigned to various simple tasks related to kitchen operation. Peeling potatoes turned out to be a common job, one that required minimal skill but produced results that directly contributed to what everyone would be eating later. Stacking cleaned trays, washing out kettles that were still warm from cooking, organizing supplies as they came off the trucks. At first, some of the prisoners balked at this arrangement, seeing it as demeaning work beneath the dignity of soldiers. Then they realized that working in the kitchen came with tangible benefits. Extra portions of stew ladled into bowls, an occasional slice of bread that hadn't been part of the official ration, the chance to stay warm near the cooking equipment instead of standing around in the cold. Through this work, through the daily proximity to the American feeding operation, the prisoners developed an understanding of how the system functioned from the inside. Everything was labelled with information about contents and quantities. Supplies were weighed and measured rather than estimated. Recipes existed not as vague guidelines but as specific formulas scaled precisely to feed hundreds of people. Fuel consumption was calculated down to the gallon to ensure the cooking equipment could operate continuously without running short. A corporal who had spent months mocking American softness now found himself quietly admiring the sheer efficiency of the operation. He spoke to another prisoner in low tones, almost embarrassed by what he was saying. "They treat food like ammunition," he observed. The same systematic approach, the same attention to supply chains and distribution, the same recognition that running out could be catastrophic. Even the guards rotated through the kitchen on a regular basis, taking turns learning basic food preparation. It wasn't a punishment or a special assignment. It was simply part of how their army functioned. Everyone understood the supply system. Everyone knew the basics of how food got from storage to serving line. Everyone ate together regardless of rank, receiving the same portions and the same quality. Some of the prisoners began to visibly regain weight, their faces filling out after months of the kind of lean rations that left men perpetually on the edge of genuine hunger. Cheeks that had been sunken developed a healthier appearance. Hands that had trembled with weakness from insufficient calories steadied as strength returned to muscle tissue. The kitchen became a focal point for quiet fascination, a subject that the prisoners discussed among themselves when they thought the guards weren't paying attention. Between shifts of peeling potatoes and washing serving equipment, they asked questions about the unfamiliar stoves, the insulated food containers, the spices they had never encountered before in military rations. One American cook, speaking in slow and careful English in an attempt to communicate across the language barrier, made a joke about hot food being a secret weapon of the United States Army. The prisoners laughed because it was clearly meant as a joke, but somewhere in the back of their minds they suspected he might actually be right. That what seemed like a humorous exaggeration was actually closer to the truth than he probably realized. In the barracks at night, when the formal structure of the day had relaxed and men could talk more freely, the prisoners compared notes and observations. Some of them dreamed aloud about the possibility of implementing similar systems back in Germany after the war ended, whenever that might be. Better kitchen equipment, more sophisticated logistics for food distribution, greater respect for the basic needs of troops in the field. They spoke about these ideas the way engineers might discuss rebuilding a bridge, recognizing that something important had been broken or missing and needed to be constructed properly. Others simply marveled at the concept of warm meals being treated as a right rather than a privilege, something soldiers could expect with the same certainty they expected to be issued ammunition or given orders. The transition they were experiencing went far beyond the physical benefits of better nutrition. It was fundamentally psychological, a shift in their entire framework for understanding what an army owed its soldiers and how military effectiveness related to soldier welfare. Food had always been a symbol of scarcity in their experience, something to be endured when it was bad and grateful for when it was adequate. The idea that it could represent abundance, that it could be delivered with the same reliability as any other military supply, required a complete reimagining of possibilities. Food as organization made visible. Food as evidence of respect for the men doing the fighting. The prisoners were coming to understand that their captors' strength didn't reside solely in superior numbers or better weapons, though those things certainly mattered. The real foundation of American military power lay in a particular mindset, a way of thinking about warfare that treated logistics as the lifeblood of combat operations rather than a secondary concern. And in adapting to that mindset, in experiencing it day after day through the simple act of eating regular hot meals, the prisoners began to see the entire war and their own place in it through a fundamentally different lens. The old certainties about their own superiority, about the weakness of their enemies, about the relationship between comfort and combat effectiveness, all of these assumptions were being systematically dismantled by the daily operation of a field kitchen. Winter settled over the prisoner camp with the kind of cold that made everything harder. Snow piled up against the barbed wire fences until you could barely see the metal underneath. The sky seemed to hover low and pale, pressing down with a weight that felt almost physical. Yet inside the camp, despite the miserable weather conditions, the kettles continued steaming and the meals continued arriving with the same reliability they had shown since the first day. German prisoners who had arrived gaunt and wary, eyes hollow with hunger and defeat, now stood straighter when roll call was conducted each morning. Their uniforms still bore all the stains and tears that came from combat and capture. But underneath those ragged clothes, their bodies were recovering health at a pace that surprised even them. The food had evolved from being simply a means of survival into something more complex. A bridge of understanding between captor and captive. A starting point for conversations that would have been impossible in those first days when suspicion and resentment still ran high. Some of the prisoners began asking questions that went beyond simple curiosity about the cooking process. They wanted to know about recipes, about techniques for roasting meat without losing all the flavor in the process, how to brew coffee properly rather than just making it hot and dark. American cooks, many of whom found the whole situation somewhere between amusing and surreal, answered these questions as best they could. The language barrier created challenges, forcing both sides to rely on broken German, hand gestures, and the occasional bit of pantomime that probably looked ridiculous to anyone watching. But communication happened anyway, facilitated by the shared understanding that food was a universal language even when words failed. The kitchen had somehow become neutral ground, a space where men who wore different uniforms and spoke different languages could interact as human beings rather than as enemies defined solely by the war that had brought them together. A young German corporal, barely into his 20s but already carrying the hardened look of someone who had survived the brutal Eastern Front, admitted quietly one day that he had never felt this strong even during what had been considered the height of German military success. He blamed the rations they had been given back then, the cold food and the insufficient quantities that left men perpetually operating below peak physical capacity. Now, eating hot meals twice a day every day, he was experiencing a level of strength and energy that made those earlier times seem even more miserable in retrospect. The Americans noticed these changes in their prisoners. Guards who had initially maintained a strict professional distance, viewing the Germans with the wariness that any captive enemy deserved, now found themselves greeting familiar faces at mealtimes. A nod of acknowledgement here, a brief exchange that might even qualify as a joke there. This didn't erase the war or transform enemies into friends, but it created something unexpected. A pocket of relative normalcy inside an abnormal situation, a space where hot food managed to blunt the sharp edges of hostility that would otherwise have defined every interaction. Letters that prisoners were allowed to send home, heavily censored by camp authorities but still representing a connection to lives beyond the wire, reflected this transformation. They wrote about the field kitchens almost as extensively as they wrote about their families or their hopes for the future. "We eat hot stew twice daily," one prisoner carefully penned in handwriting that tried to be neat enough to pass inspection. "It is better than our own army ever provided for us, even in the best of times." For the German officers among the prisoners, men who had been trained to think tactically and strategically about military operations, the revelation cut even deeper than it did for the enlisted men. They were beginning to understand that the American fighting machine wasn't built on any single component. It wasn't just about having more tanks or better aircraft or superior numbers. It was about integration, about bringing together logistics and supply and morale and combat effectiveness into a unified system where each part reinforced all the others. Some of these officers whispered among themselves that this might be the real explanation for Allied success, the fundamental reason why the tide of war had turned so decisively. Tanks and airplanes were visible. You could see them, count them, measure your own capabilities against them in straightforward numerical terms. But kitchens and supply convoys and the entire infrastructure that kept soldiers fed and healthy, those were invisible weapons that operated below the level of what traditional military analysis focused on. The camp itself was starting to feel less like a place of punishment and more like an inadvertent classroom. Each ladle of soup represented a lesson in how an industrialized society with massive manufacturing capacity approached the problem of total war. Each meal was a demonstration of principles that went against everything these German soldiers had been taught about the relationship between hardship and military effectiveness. The lesson was bitter for many of them to swallow, harder to digest than the actual food they were consuming. They had been raised in a system that taught them to sneer at comfort, to view deprivation as character building, to see suffering as proof of dedication to the cause. But now they were being shown that comfort could be a form of power, that taking care of soldiers' basic needs wasn't a sign of weakness but an enabler of strength, that you could feed people well and still maintain discipline and combat effectiveness. That realization marked a genuine turning point in how these prisoners understood the war they had been fighting. It represented a shift from mockery based on ignorance to respect grounded in direct experience, from envy of what they didn't have to understanding of why it mattered. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Some prisoners clung to their old beliefs, finding ways to dismiss or minimize what they were experiencing. But for many, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The American system worked. It produced results. And those results were visible not just in battlefield victories, but in the strength and morale of individual soldiers who knew they would be fed reliably regardless of how chaotic the tactical situation became. As spring began to approach in 1945, the prisoners could sense that the war was moving toward its conclusion. The flow of news, even the heavily filtered version that reached them in camp, made it clear that Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts. German resistance continued, but with an increasingly desperate quality that suggested the end was approaching, whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not. The prisoners watched Allied convoys roll past their camp from time to time, trucks and half-tracks and jeeps, all moving with purpose. Lined up behind many of these vehicles were trailers carrying field kitchen equipment, still being moved forward to feed troops who were continuing to push into German territory. The sight reinforced everything the prisoners had learned during their captivity. The feeding operation wasn't temporary or limited to rear areas. It was integral to how American forces operated, following combat units right up to and sometimes into active engagement zones. Inside the camp, the daily rhythm of hot meals had become so familiar that it no longer prompted conscious thought. Coffee at dawn had become as automatic as breathing. Warm stew at dusk was simply how evenings began, as predictable as sunset. The prisoners could measure their entire captivity not by punishments or restrictions, but by mealtimes that came with reliable regularity. What had started as shocking and incomprehensible had become routine and expected. The smell of coffee brewing no longer made them stop what they were doing to marvel at it. The clatter of metal trays being distributed was just background noise now, part of the normal soundscape of camp life. For many of the prisoners, this consistency planted seeds that would grow into ideas about how things might be different after the war ended. If an army could treat its captives, its enemies, with this level of systematic care and attention to basic needs, what did that same army provide for its own soldiers? What could Germany become if it adopted similar principles, if it built systems around taking care of people rather than glorifying their suffering? Some men spoke quietly among themselves about these possibilities, discussing them like engineers planning a reconstruction project, better kitchen facilities in future German military units, improved logistics for distributing supplies, a fundamental re-evaluation of the relationship between soldier welfare and combat effectiveness. They approached these ideas tentatively at first, aware that they were questioning doctrines that had been treated as unshakable truth for years. But the evidence was right there in front of them, served up daily in metal trays and metal cups. American guards, for their part, observed the change in their prisoners' demeanor and attitudes. The hard stares of defiance that had characterized those first days had softened into something more contemplative. The questions prisoners asked evolved from challenges to genuine inquiries about how things worked. In the evenings after work, details had been completed and the formal structure of military routine had relaxed slightly. Prisoners would gather near the fence line in small groups. They watched American supply convoys arrive, trucks pulling up in organized formations, crews unloading supplies with the kind of practiced efficiency that made the whole operation look deceptively simple. The prisoners were realizing that this wasn't the product of some temporary abundance, some accident of having too many resources and not enough sense about how to use them properly. This was deliberate doctrine, a conscious choice to prioritize morale through systematic attention to soldier welfare. Hot meals as a strategic weapon against despair and defeat. Food as fuel, not just for bodies, but for the will to keep fighting. In letters that prisoners wrote home during this period, assuming those letters made it through the censorship process and actually reached their families, some men wrote almost wistfully about the field kitchens they were experiencing. They described the kettles and the coffee and the bread as if they were documenting some strange new civilization that operated on principles completely foreign to their previous understanding. For others, the memory of that very first hot meal, that initial stew served just hours after capture, would remain sharper and more vivid than memories of battles they had fought or comrades they had lost. It represented proof that their old image of the enemy had been fundamentally wrong, built on propaganda and assumption rather than actual understanding. Years later, when historians would interview surviving prisoners about their experiences, many of them would point to the American field kitchens as one of the most profound shocks of their captivity. Not the barbed wire fences, not the armed guards, not the interrogations or the restrictions on freedom. The food. The systematic, reliable, hot food that kept coming day after day, regardless of weather or tactical situation or any other factor that might have disrupted it. In the end, those field kitchens accomplished something that no amount of propaganda could ever achieve. They changed minds through direct experience rather than rhetoric. They demonstrated that strength could manifest in unexpected forms, that power wasn't just about weapons and numbers, but about the capacity to care for people while simultaneously conducting military operations. That an army could serve soup under fire and somehow be stronger rather than weaker for doing so. As the war ground toward its final conclusion and prisoners began preparing mentally for whatever came next, for repatriation or continued captivity or an uncertain future in a defeated nation, they knew they would be leaving with more than just their freedom. They would carry with them a lesson about an army that had fought as fiercely with logistics and planning as it had fought with bullets and shells. A lesson about the relationship between taking care of soldiers and military effectiveness. A lesson that hot meals delivered under fire represented not weakness or softness, but a quiet, unstoppable form of power that had helped carry the Allied forces to victory. The field kitchens that German propaganda had mocked as evidence of American decadence had turned out to be one of the most powerful weapons in the Allied arsenal, not because they killed enemies, but because they sustained friends. And that lesson, learned over countless bowls of stew and cups of coffee in a prisoner camp, would stay with these men for the rest of their lives.